Now here's Jim O'Hagan.
Today, Walter, we consider the life of Harry Midgley, a complex politician of yesteryear who still arouses intense interest and indeed controversy even today. Harry Midgley was born on the 8th of September 1892 at 59 Seaview Street in North Belfast. He came from what might be called a solid working class background. His father died early, leaving his mother to bring up her family in fairly straitened circumstances, a fact which had a strong influence on the young Harry, in that he realised from an early age the value of a good education. Coming from what has been described as a Christian socialist home, imbued in him a burning desire to improve the lot of the working class in the early years of the 20th century. Another factor which had an influence on his early political thought was the impact of the results of the 1907 Belfast dock strike, where in effect the dockers and carters who took strike action had little to show for their efforts to improve their pay and conditions after lengthy industrial action. As well, too, he went along and spoke at the Custom House steps, where each weekend fiery orators could be heard extolling working people to stand up for their rights, and also condemning the excesses of the capitalist system as then pertained. Harry was able to remain at Duncairn National School until he was 14. Not too many working-class children had this advantage in those days. Regarding education, it seems he was always greatly influenced by his mother, who instilled in him a lifelong love of learning and of books. After school, he worked briefly as a messenger boy for 4 shillings for a 60-hour week, and then served his time as a joiner in Workman Clark's shipyard in Belfast. In his late teens, the formative influences on his socialist thinking was the Belfast man William Walker, and especially James Connolly, whose ideas of a socialist Ireland after Home Rule fired him with inspiration. Incidentally, Walter, Connolly was to die in 1916 for his part in the Easter Rising of that year. Harry Midgley emigrated to the United States in the winter of 1912-13, having become somewhat disillusioned with his work as a joiner, leaving before he finished his apprenticeship. In the USA, he became a labourer, but became much involved in trade union affairs there. He returned home on holiday to Belfast in the summer of 1914, and instead of returning to the United States, joined the army when war with Germany was declared later the same year. During the Great War, he saw service on the Somme and elsewhere and was gassed. He wrote poetry as a relief from the tensions of war all around him. After his return from the war, he became a full-time organiser with the Linen Lappers Union in 1920, and in the early years of the 1920s threw himself fully into Belfast Labour politics. In the 1923 and 24 general elections for Westminster, he stood as an anti-partition Labour candidate for West Belfast and gave a creditable performance, though not taking the seat on either occasion. In 1925, he became a councillor on the Belfast Corporation for the Dock Ward, standing as a Northern Ireland Labour Party candidate, and thus began his political association, which was to last for many years with this part of Belfast. Midgley from the beginning agitated for socialist solutions for the people he represented, and indeed further afield. Thus better health care, greater educational and employment opportunities, as well as the provision of improved housing stock were his priorities. The Dock Ward had long been known as the Red Ward and had been connected in the past in particular to James Connolly. Patrick Shea, in his Voices and the Sound of Drums, indicates that at this period Midgley's thinking on politics was pretty close to the idea of an Irish Workers' Republic. In June 1927, speaking in support of the Irish Labour candidate for Louth in the Free State general election, he stated that when the fight for Home Rule was on, he was proud at that time to have taken his stand for it, and would do so again for the right of the Irish people to manage their own affairs. However, it seems that in his thinking he was always closer to socialism than to nationalism. But as time wore on, say from the early 30s, his belief in a united Ireland waned when he saw, for him, what were the advantages of the British link to Northern Ireland. In the 1933 general election for Stormont, Midgley stood as a Northern Ireland Labour Party candidate in the Dock division of Belfast and beat his unionist opponent fairly comfortably. To some extent he had to ride two horses politically here, and some said he was all things to all men. However, it is true to say that he was loved, especially by the Catholics of Dock, who took him as a man after their own hearts, many having a passionate devotion to him, some having a lighted picture of him in their windows. Jerry Fitt, speaking years afterwards, recalled him as having great charisma when Fitt heard him speak at election meetings in the nationalist or Catholic parts of the constituency. When Harry got to Stormont and agitated for a full socialist programme, he found that many unionists strongly disliked and even hated him. For his own part, the feelings were mutual, as he had a strong contempt for many of the unionist members of the House for their big business and land-owning connections. He was a great orator and had a strong, driving, forceful personality. Sometimes, though, his tongue got the better of him, and he overstepped the mark and lacerated verbally his opponents. Midgley, as I've said, was a cultivated and well-read man with quite a love for classical music and opera, yet he had a strong common touch to him. His socialism was never exclusively parish pump, rather it was international, and this was to lead him into serious conflict with a large section of his electorate in 1936. In that year, the Spanish Civil War began, and the conflict inflamed passions on both sides in Spain and further afield. Midgley was a strong supporter of the democratically elected Republican government, which was opposed to the nationalist forces of General Franco. The Catholic Church at the time was a strong supporter of the General, and nowhere more strongly than in Ireland, and so Midgley found himself clashing head-on with the local Catholic authorities in Dock, and with many faithful lay Catholics too, in the area and in Belfast generally. The nub of the disagreement on the Catholic side was that for them, the Republican government in Spain was essentially communistic in ethos, which had been associated with priest hunting and the burning of Catholic churches. Midgley countered this by stating that it had been democratically elected in February 1936 to right the many abuses which he saw as bedeviling Spain for many years past, and he labelled its opponents as fascists. Whilst it would take too long here, Walter, to go into the merits or otherwise of each side's case, the whole affair locally became very acrimonious and bitter. Midgley for some months engaged in voluminous correspondence through the Irish News with his opponents. The paper itself was very pro-Franco, and at times the tone of his remarks were seen by many as being bigoted and anti-Catholic. There is no doubt that even his supporters would agree that there were occasions in the controversy when his tongue led him to say extreme things which would have been better left unsaid. But that was the man. During this time, he debated the issue publicly with Father Arthur Ryan, then an academic at Queen's, who later became Monsignor Ryan and known throughout Ireland and further afield. It is also reported that on one occasion, Midgley and the local parish priest, Father John McSparran, nearly came to physical blows over the whole issue. Viewed, Walter, from this distance of time, it is admittedly very difficult to see why Midgley ploughed quite so deeply into the Spanish controversy with a large and influential section of his constituents. One feels he may have been better to let his feelings be known and leave it there. However, he was always influenced by international affairs, as well as the local, and so he simply could not confine himself to purely local affairs. From this time on, his relationship with a large section of the Catholic community in Dock went steadily downhill, and in the Stormont general election in 1938 he lost his seat, coming a poor third behind his Unionist and Nationalist opponents, the Catholic vote having been badly split. The legacy of this defeat had a souring effect on Harry, and in succeeding years, certainly on his part, his relationship with the Catholic Church grew more and more bitter. By this time, too, he had been chairman of the Northern Ireland Labour Party for a long time. Indeed, many saw him as the Northern Ireland Labour Party, in that often he made pronouncements on certain issues in such a way that indicated his views were party policy, when in fact they were not. He was a very dominant personality. Antagonisms arose as well between the different wings of the Labour movement, which was always something of an uneasy coalition. Anyway, between those in it who favoured stronger British links with the mainstream party in London, of which Midgley was one, and thus were partitionists, and those who followed a socialist anti-partition line. However, a fragile unity was maintained by Midgley at a by-election in 1941, surprisingly winning the seat of Willowfield at Stormont for the Northern Ireland Labour Party, beating his Unionist opponent handsomely. But dissent and dissatisfaction came to the fore again within the party, and eventually he was deposed as chairman in December 1942. Midgley appealed this soon afterwards, but without waiting to hear the results of the appeal, then resigned, an act which caused his expulsion from the party, and so he set up his own Commonwealth Labour Party early in 1943. Midgley had latterly felt that if the Northern Ireland Labour Party was to break the hegemony of the Unionist Party and become a political force to be reckoned with, then it would have to declare itself a solidly partitionist party on the border issue. This it would not do, so he became disillusioned with it. The title Commonwealth Labour appealed very much to Midgley, as he had always looked upon the British Commonwealth as a brotherhood of nations. Also, it seems he had been greatly impressed by the pre-war New Zealand government, which had brought in socialist reforms, which predated the 1945 Labour government's programme in Great Britain. In the spring of 1943, Sir Basil Brooke, the new Northern Ireland Prime Minister, appointed Harry as Minister for Social Security. Thus he was the first non-member of the Unionist Party to serve in the Northern Ireland Cabinet. He became Minister for Labour in June 1944. Harry enjoyed the confidence and friendship of Brooke, who it is said admired him greatly for his stand on the Union. However, some of the Unionist backbenchers, especially some of the old guard who were there before Brooke succeeded Andrews, resented Harry and mistrusted his socialist thinking and gave him a rough time of it. On the opposition side of the House, many called him a traitor and a Judas. His relationship with the anti-partitionist Labour member Jack Beattie was poor. On one occasion in October 1945, they came to blows, Midgley hitting Beattie, and later in the day a further scuffle developed in the chamber, and both had to be ejected. He was generally, though, considered an able minister. At the end of the war, Midgley resigned his cabinet post just before this clash with Beattie and returned to the opposition benches. He contested the South Belfast seat at the 1945 general election in the Commonwealth Labour Party interest, but was defeated and thus spent the next 2 years in opposition to Brooke's government. In 1947, Harry joined the Ulster Unionist Party. His Commonwealth Party petered out shortly afterwards. He always maintained that he joined the Unionists because by that time he felt Brooke's party had accepted the reforms of the 1945 Attlee government in Great Britain and had begun to apply them to Northern Ireland. However, his critics at the time said that he had joined because he felt he might obtain political office once again under Brooke. He became an Orangeman too at this time. At any rate, he had to wait until late 1949 before becoming a minister again, returning to the new Ministry of Labour and National Insurance. Before that, though, he had been a bitter opponent of the 1947 Education Act's provision, which gave 65% capital grants to the voluntary, mainly Catholic schools. Was his Catholic bile due to his previous fracas with the Church over Spain in the 1930s, or to some inherent anti-Catholic bias on his part? It is not possible to say. Anyway, he had barely time to grow accustomed to his new ministry when Hall Thompson, the education minister, resigned, and he himself was appointed in his place. Thus, Harry became education minister in June 1950, and he held this post until his death. It would be true to say, I think, Walter, that Midgley had regained his cabinet seat because from the time he joined the party, he had become, in his own words, a unionist evangelist, and played a prominent part in the challenge which faced the party in 1949 at the so-called Chapelgate election, often indulging in anti-Catholic rhetoric. Some thought Basil Brooke was mad for appointing him education minister. After all, he was the most vociferous critic of the 1947 Education Act. From the outset of his tenure, he did not attempt to undo any of the provisions of that act. Thus it can be seen that he trimmed his political thinking to suit the realities of the time. Maybe Brooke's appointment of him was a shrewd way of silencing him. For the first few years of the early 50s, education progress regarding the rebuilding programme was slow. The raising of the school-leaving age had, Walter, to be postponed twice. It did not, in fact, become law until the 1st of April 57. However, gradually, Midgley and his officials, with the cooperation of all the authorities associated with education, got on top of their problems. The minister and his most senior official, R.S. Brownell, the permanent secretary at the time, did not always see eye to eye. Indeed, Midgley suspected that at times the senior officials tried to run the department behind his back. Midgley disliked the formality of the place. Patrick Shea recounts at least one tempestuous verbal brawl between Harry and the rather dour Brownell. Matters did come to a head in 1956 when Midgley overruled the decision of Brownell not to award teacher training scholarships on medical grounds to a number of students. The permanent secretary was so piqued that he asked the Public Accounts Committee of the Stormont Commons for a review of the cases. Subsequently, after Midgley's death, in a majority of cases the committee found in favour of Brownell. Although Midgley's personality became somewhat more serene as the years went on, there is no doubt that he always had to watch his temper. At the same time, he could be a most genial character and a real man of the people. Patrick Shea again records him, if one happened to enter his room, they might encounter him with a number of football officials, one love of his life being Linfield Football Club, whose chairman he was for a number of years, or alternatively with a group of ordinary working-class people there to complain or to petition him in his capacity as a man with influence generally in Northern Ireland affairs. At these meetings, his officials would always address him formally, but to members of the public he was Harry. One irritated civil servant remarked that the minister was Harry to every Tom and Dick. One story about him, and it is real Yes Minister material from the popular BBC TV series of some years ago, relates how upon an evening Midgley was descending the staircase of the ministry when he met the permanent secretary, who apparently said, "Good night, Mr. Minister." Harry duly replying, "Good night, Mr. Permanent Secretary." Further down the stairs he met an assistant secretary who said, "Good night, Mr. Minister," and who was given the reply, "Good night, Mr. Assistant Secretary." Still further down near the bottom he met a principal officer who said, "Good night, Mr. Minister." Harry duly replied again, "Good night, Mr. Principal." Right at the bottom he met one of the cleaners who greeted him with, "Good night, Harry," to which Harry replied, "Good night, Jean." So there you are, Walter. He certainly had a common touch. Another story relates how, on an occasion in his capacity as Minister for Education, he attended a schoolboy international soccer match between Northern Ireland and England in Belfast, England winning 7-0. After the game at the reception for the two teams, Midgley astonished some of his senior officials in the ministry who were present by giving an amazing speech in which he stated that not only was it a privilege for the Irish boys to be given the opportunity of playing their English counterparts, but a double privilege to be beaten 7-0 by them. Astounding, isn't it? And yet he was cheered, it is said, to the echo by all present. If memory serves me right, Walter, I remember attending that game at Grosvenor Park as a young boy in 1954 or 55. The Irish boys showed more skill on the night, but the English lads were much bigger physically. I remember too someone on the terrace near me saying that this was because we left school earlier than the English in those days, so the Irish team would have been a year younger. Another rather funny story concerns the occasion when Harry was chairman of a committee designing a blazer badge for the Linfield players. As the motto they chose the Latin inscription In hoc signo vinces, which translates as by this sign you will conquer. One day Harry asked the moderator of the Presbyterian Church what sign it referred to. The moderator replied, the sign of the cross. Apparently, it is said, Harry went off to make some urgent telephone calls. Incidentally, I'm not sure what happened to the badge after that. Midgley died on the 29th of April 1957 at the Musgrave and Clark Clinic in Belfast after suffering a heart attack whilst attending the Ulster Teachers' Union Congress. He was 64 years of age, and so Northern Ireland had lost its very colourful Minister for Education. His funeral service was held at Carlisle Memorial Methodist Church in Belfast, and afterwards large crowds lined the Antrim Road on their cortege's way to Carnmoney Cemetery, where he was buried. The minister who took the service said that Midgley lived with a zest and an exuberant vitality. Many tributes were paid to him after his death, an interesting one in the Belfast Telegraph in May 1957 coming from Dr. Eugene O'Doherty, Catholic Bishop of Dromore, who recognised his contribution to Northern Ireland education. Indeed, many Catholics attested to him helping them greatly in a private capacity. This in spite of Midgley's often outspoken and rather tactless attacks on the Catholic Church and its educational policy down the years. There were those in the 1950s who believed that his pandering to unionist extremism was an attempt to undermine Brooke and become leader himself. This is an intriguing thought, but it cannot be substantiated. Graham Walker has written a fine biography of Harry Midgley in 1985, published by Manchester University Press. In it, he assesses his subject very fairly and in a balanced way, and gives credit where credit is due. But he does state that despite Midgley's achievements as a politician, in his later years, he lacked that vision of generosity towards the minority community, which might have been expected of him, taking his earlier socialist beliefs into consideration. For his early career as a socialist in Dock Ward, there is a very good and sympathetic account in a booklet called Sailor Town, edited by Dennis Smith. Perhaps Patrick Shea sums Midgley up best by stating, and I quote, "When he died, one thought sadly of the young fighting iconoclast, and wondered what mountains he might have climbed had his character been shaped in a more mature environment and the circumstances which influenced his political life been less parochial. For my own part, I could not agree more."
Jim O'Hagan's portrait of Harry Midgley. That was the Real Peter Street, a traditional melody arranged by David Curry as one of his Irish rhythms, and another piece of music which was a favourite of Harry Midgley. That recording was by the BBC Northern Ireland Light Orchestra, conducted by Havelock Nelson. Now,